What if I told you that the entire might of the invincible Roman legions, which conquered half the known world, rested on a single, simple, almost primitive food? This wasn't an exotic warrior's diet, but a carefully calibrated system that fueled not only the muscles, but the very spirit of the empire. We are used to imagining legionaries as grim warriors, but we almost never think about what lay in their campaign kettles. The truth about the Roman army's diet is far more complex and interesting than it first appears, and it reveals the secrets of their discipline, logistics, and endurance. This food was the fuel for a machine that could not be allowed to stop. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn which single drink, despised by the elite, was more important to a soldier than clean water, and how it helped them stay in the ranks. I will reveal to you one of the main secrets that explains why the Roman army was so effective. It all comes down to the fact that its foundation was not weapons or armor, but a simple and humble cereal: wheat. For a Roman, grain was not just food, it was a symbol of civilization, order, and a settled life. It was the direct opposite of the chaotic and unpredictable diet of the barbarians, who in the Romans' view, ate whatever they could find. Therefore, supplying the legions with grain was not just a matter of logistics, but a fundamental ideological task. A soldier who received his ration of wheat received not just calories, he received a piece of Rome. This ration connected him to home, to the orderly world he was defending on the wild frontiers. Wheat was a universal currency and a universal fuel. It could be stored for months or even years in dry granaries, making it the ideal strategic resource. No other product possessed such a combination of nutrition, durability, and ease of transport. The main type of grain that formed the basis of the diet was wheat, known as triticum. It was from this that panis militaris, or military bread, was made. However, the diet also included barley, or hordeum. Barley was considered a less prestigious grain, the food of gladiators or peasants. But its value lay in its hardiness, as it could grow where wheat could not, for example, in the colder and wetter climates of the northern provinces. Each legionary received his ration in the form of whole, unprocessed grain. This was not due to the quartermaster's laziness, but for a very pragmatic reason. Whole grain stores much longer than flour, which spoils quickly, absorbs moisture, and attracts pests. Thus, the army shifted the final stage of processing, milling, onto the shoulders of the soldiers themselves. This ensured that they would always have fresh flour for cooking. This milling process was an important part of the daily routine. Each soldier carried a small hand mill, a mola manuaria. These were two round millstones that allowed a portion of grain to be quickly turned into coarse flour. This flour then became the basis for the legionaries' two main dishes, bread and porridge. Bread was preferred but required time for baking. Porridge, or poles, was a quicker and simpler option. Besides bread and porridge, the flour was used to make buxaletum, the so-called soldier's biscuit or hardtack. This was a very hard, twice-baked bread that could be stored almost indefinitely. It was tough and often had to be soaked in water, wine, or that special drink we will talk about later. These biscuits formed the basis of the emergency rations that a soldier carried with him on the march. Grain was so important that any disruption in its supply could cause serious unrest among the troops. A hungry legion was dangerous not only to the enemy, but also to its own commanders. Therefore, the entire gigantic logistical machine of the empire was primarily geared towards the uninterrupted supply of the army with this strategic product. Roman roads, ports, and giant granaries, Horea, were all built with this one main goal in mind. Wheat was not just food, it was an instrument of discipline. As a punishment, a delinquent unit could be switched from wheat to barley. This was not so much a physical as a moral humiliation. A soldier forced to eat barley porridge felt debased, which served as a powerful disciplinary lever. Thus, even the soldier's mess reflected the strict hierarchy of the Roman world. This focus on grain also determined the strategy of warfare. The Roman army could not stay long where there was no possibility of organizing the delivery of wheat or its requisition on the spot. Wars were fought along rivers and roads, by which supplies could be established. The legions were tied to their grain wagons, and this was both their strength and their main vulnerability. The entire system was designed for maximum efficiency. A standardized ration meant standardized supply. Quartermasters didn't need to rack their brains over menu variety. They needed to provide a certain number of modi of grain per soldier per day. This predictability and reliability was the foundation upon which Roman conquests were built. And what do you think? Could a modern person survive on such a monotonous but nutritious diet? What was the main thing about it? The calories or the symbolic meaning invested in it? It's very interesting to know your point of view. Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how much a soldier's ration actually weighed? When we say ration, we imagine something abstract, but for a legionary, it was very specific kilograms that he had to carry on his person. This system was called the annona militaris, the military allowance, and it was the cornerstone of all army life, strictly regulated and mandatory. The central element of the ration, as we have already found out, was grain. Sources like Polybius give us fairly precise figures. Each legionary received approximately 2 modi of grain per month. Converted to modern measures, this is about 850–900 grams of grain per day. This is a very large amount, providing about 3,000 to 4,000 calories. This calorie volume was absolutely necessary. A legionary was not just a soldier. He was an engineer, a builder, and a laborer. Daily marches of many kilometers with a full pack, which weighed up to 40 kilograms, required a colossal expenditure of energy. In addition, soldiers dug ditches, built camps, felled forests, and laid roads. Their grain ration was calculated precisely for such extreme loads. It is important to understand that these 900 grams are the weight of dry, unprocessed grain. After milling and baking bread or cooking porridge, its weight and volume increased significantly. Thus, the soldier received a very impressive portion of food. But this grain was only the basis, the so-called frumentum. It was accompanied by other products that made this diet at least somewhat balanced. Besides grain, the ration included what the Romans collectively called condimentum, or seasoning. This was everything that was eaten with bread or porridge. First and foremost, this was salt. Salt was not just a flavor enhancer, but a vital mineral that legionaries lost in huge quantities with sweat during marches and engineering work. The very word salary, salarium, comes from the word sal, salt. This indicates that in the early stages, salt might have been issued as part of the pay, or soldiers received special money to buy it. Supplying the army with salt was just as important a task as supplying it with grain. Its lack could quickly lead to a loss of combat effectiveness for an entire unit. Other important components of the condimentum were legumes, such as lentils and beans. They were an excellent source of plant-based protein, which supplemented the carbohydrate base of the diet. Legumes also stored well in dried form and were easy to transport. They were boiled together with the grain, creating a thick and hearty pottage. Vegetables were also included in the ration when they could be obtained. On the march, soldiers could gather wild herbs and roots. In stationary camps, or castra stativa, legions often planted their own gardens, growing cabbage, onions, garlic, and turnips. This not only diversified the menu, but also provided the soldiers with necessary vitamins. Was this allowance free? Not entirely. Although the state guaranteed the supply, the cost of grain and other basic products was often deducted from the legionaries' pay. It was a complex accounting system where the soldier received not a net salary, but the difference between his assigned pay and the cost of his upkeep. However, during campaigns or as a reward, the emperor might announce the distribution of provisions for free. This system, the annona militaris, was a marvel of bureaucracy and logistics. It required precise accounting of personnel, the existence of gigantic warehouses, and a perfectly tuned transportation system. Each soldier was a cog in this machine, and his ration was the grease that ensured its smooth operation. This ration was not about culinary delights, but about predictability and efficiency. But even the most filling bread becomes unbearable if there is nothing to wash it down with. And here we come to one of the most surprising and incomprehensible aspects of the Roman diet for us. Are you ready to find out what drink the legionaries valued above all else, and why it was the key to their health on the march? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of the drink called Pascha. What you are about to see will completely change your perception of ancient beverages. Forget pure spring water or expensive wines. The most important, most common, and most vital drink of the Roman legionary was Pascha. This simple, cheap, and frankly sour drink was a true secret weapon that helped soldiers survive in the harshest conditions. So what is Pascha? In essence, it was a mixture of water and sour wine, or wine vinegar. Most often, the cheapest wine that was already beginning to turn, or simply wine vinegar, which was a byproduct of winemaking, was used to make it. This sour base was diluted with water, sometimes with a little honey or herbs added for taste, although the army version of the drink was likely extremely austere. Why did soldiers drink what was essentially acidified water? There were several reasons for this, all of them extremely pragmatic. First, and most importantly, acetic acid had antiseptic properties. In field conditions, where water sources were often of dubious quality, adding vinegar to the water was a basic hygiene measure. It was an ancient method of disinfection that significantly reduced the risk of intestinal disorders. Second, Pascha quenched thirst excellently. In the hot climate of the Mediterranean or during grueling marches, plain water was often not enough. The sour taste of Pascha stimulated salivation and was much more refreshing than fresh water. Soldiers could drink a large amount of this beverage without feeling oversaturated. Third, it was a matter of taste and habit. Plain water could taste unpleasant, stagnant, or warm. The vinegar masked all the unpleasant flavors, making drinking more acceptable. Furthermore, it was the energy drink of its time. The vinegar and residual sugars from the wine provided a small but quick boost of calories. Fourth, Pascha had an important social and psychological aspect. Expensive, aged wine was the drink of the elite, of senators and the wealthy. Pascha, however, was the drink of the common people, the drink of soldiers. By drinking it, a legionary demonstrated his endurance, his unpretby, and his belonging to the military brotherhood. This drink was a symbol of sobriety and readiness for service, unlike wine, which could lead to a relaxation of discipline. Sources confirm that Pascha was a standard part of the army ration. Soldiers carried flasks of this drink with them. Emperor Hadrian, known for his love of the soldier's life, reportedly drank Pascha with the legionaries during campaigns, demonstrating his unity with the army. This was a powerful gesture that raises authority. The preparation of Pascha required no effort. Vinegar or sour wine was cheap and available in any province where wine was made. Soldiers were probably issued a concentrated vinegar base, which they diluted themselves with water from local sources. This was much simpler and cheaper than hauling wagon loads of clean drinking water behind the army. One should not confuse Pascha with wine, which was also part of the ration but served a different function. Wine was more for raising morale, for consumption in the camp in the evening, after all work was done. Pascha, on the other hand, was a technical drink, consumed throughout the day, during work and on the march. It was a functional beverage that solved specific problems, quenching thirst, disinfecting, and maintaining vitality. Modern attempts to recreate Pascha show that the drink has a rather specific, but not necessarily unpleasant taste. Especially if you add a little honey, it resembles a non-carbonated, sour lemonade or kvass. For a person exhausted by heat and physical exertion, such a drink could indeed seem like a salvation. Thus, this humble drink was no less important than grain. It protected the army from diseases, maintained its water balance, and served as a symbol of the soldier's life. Pascha is a prime example of Roman pragmatism, the ability to take the simplest and cheapest product and turn it into an effective tool for achieving great goals. This system of nutrition seems almost vegetarian: bread, porridge, vegetables, and vinegar water. But surely warriors who perform such heavy labor didn't eat meat at all. Give this video a like if you've also wondered about this, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new history videos. What if I told you that everything you've been taught about the legionary diet is outdated? A common myth holds that the Roman army was made up of vegetarians who subsisted exclusively on grain. This myth is very convenient But like most myths, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Yes, grain was the foundation, but meat or picus also played an important, albeit not daily, role in the diet, and even more importantly, in the morale of the legion. The idea of vegetarianism probably arose because grain was the guaranteed ration, while meat was not. Grain could be easily stored and transported, and it formed the basis of calories. Meat, on the other hand, was a perishable product, and its logistics were incomparably more complex. Therefore, it was not part of the daily, standardized ration issued by the quartermasters. However, this does not mean that soldiers did not eat it. An army on the march often herded livestock, which served as provisions on the hoof. This was the most effective way to provide soldiers with fresh meat far from supply bases. Tending to these herds was part of the duties of special units. What kind of meat did the legionaries prefer? Judging by archaeological finds at Roman campsites, the absolute favorite was pork. The pig is an animal that grows quickly and provides a lot of nutritious meat and, even more importantly, fat. Fat, or laridum, lard bacon, was no less valuable a product than the meat itself. Bacon and salt meat were ideal campaign food. They could be salted, dried, or smoked, which allowed them to be stored for a very long time. Soldiers could carry a piece of salt bacon with them and add it to their Paul's porridge or bean pottage. This not only enriched the dish with protein and fats, but also made it tastier and more filling. Besides pork, beef, and mutton, or goat, were also consumed. Cattle were not only a source of meat, but also draft animals, so they were probably used for food less often when the animals grew old or could no longer work. Mutton was more common in the eastern provinces, where sheep farming was a traditional industry. Archaeological excavations at stationary forts, such as Vindolanda in Britain, provide us with a wealth of material. Analysis of bone remains from rubbish pits shows enormous variety. Soldiers ate not only pork and beef, but also game, which they hunted in the surrounding forests. This shows that the diet was much richer than one might have assumed. Meat also played an important ritual and social role. On religious holidays or to celebrate a military victory, feasts were held. On such days, a large number of livestock were slaughtered, and the meat was distributed among all the soldiers. This was not just the satisfaction of hunger, but an act of unity that strengthened morale. Furthermore, meat was a reward. Officers could reward distinguished soldiers with an extra portion of meat or the best cuts. At the same time, deprivation of meat could be a form of punishment. It was a simple and understandable management tool that commanders actively used. Thus, the legionaries' diet was not vegetarian, but grain-centric. Grain provided the energy for daily work, while meat was an important supplement, a source of protein and fats, and also a powerful factor in maintaining morale. A soldier who received meat felt the care of his command and was ready for new achievements. Of course, in field conditions, one could not always count on a wagon with bacon or a herd of livestock. What did a legionary do when organized supplies were cut off? In the next chapter, we will find out how soldiers turned into foragers and what they could find to supplement their meager rations. When the legions were in enemy or simply undeveloped territory, organized supply often failed. In these cases, one of the legionaries' most important skills came into play: the ability to feed himself. This process, known as pabulatio, or foraging, was not just random gathering, but an organized and vital activity. Soldiers had to know what was edible and what was not. Foraging was a risky business. Soldiers who strayed far from the main camp in search of food were vulnerable to enemy ambushes. Therefore, foraging parties always operated under guard, ready to repel an attack at any moment. Caesar, in his Commentaries on the Gallic War, repeatedly mentions skirmishes that occurred precisely during the gathering of provisions. So what were the soldiers looking for? First and foremost, they were interested in wild edible plants. These could be various herbs that went into pottage, such as wild sorrel or nettles. Soldiers were experienced botanists by necessity. They had to be able to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones. This knowledge was often passed down from veterans to new recruits. Wild fruits and berries were of huge importance. Depending on the season and locality, these could be wild apples, pears, plums, blackberries, raspberries, or sloes. Fruits were not only a source of calories and pleasure, but also a vital source of vitamins, which were so lacking in the standard grain diet. This was a simple and effective prevention against scurvy. In southern regions, soldiers could gather figs, grapes, or dates. These products were very nutritious and could be easily dried, turning them into a long-term supply. Dried figs were an excellent source of quick energy during a long march. Another important resource was nuts and seeds. Hazelnuts, acorns, chestnuts. All these were collected, dried, and could be used to enrich the diet. Acorns, for example, were soaked to remove bitterness and then ground into a meal that was added to bread or porridge. It was a nutritious, though not the most delicious product. Besides plants, soldiers looked for mushrooms. This required special care and deep knowledge, as a mistake could cost a life. However, mushrooms were valued in Roman culinary tradition, and there were likely soldiers who knew how to identify them. Collected mushrooms were dried or immediately added to pottage. We should not forget honey. Wild honey was the only available sweetener and a real delicacy. Discovering a hive of wild bees was a great stroke of luck. Honey was not only eaten, but also used to preserve fruits or to make honey-based drinks. In coastal areas, the diet could be supplemented with mollusks and seaweed. Soldiers gathered oysters, mussels, and other edible sea creatures during low tide. This was a valuable and easily accessible source of protein that did not require complex skills. This process of gathering was not just a supplement to the ration, it was a school of survival. It taught soldiers to be observant, resourceful, and self-reliant. A legionary who knew how to find food in the wild was a much more valuable warrior than one who was completely dependent on the quartermaster's wagon train. Here is what happens behind the closed doors of soldierly life, or more accurately, behind the flap of the tent. The Roman army was organized with incredible precision, and this organization permeated all spheres of life, including food preparation. The basis of this system was the contubernium, the smallest unit of the legion, consisting of 8 men. These 8 soldiers were not just comrades in arms, they were one family that shared one tent, one kettle, and one meal. It was precisely at the level of the contubernium that all the magic of the field kitchen took place. There were no centralized canteens in our understanding in the Roman army, especially on the march. Each contubernium received its share of products, primarily grain, and was responsible for preparing it themselves. This was a brilliant solution that relieved the command of a huge layer of domestic concerns. The unit's main kitchen tool was the hand mill, the mola manuaria. As we have already mentioned, soldiers received grain, not flour. Therefore, the first task was for 2 soldiers from the contubernium to grind the daily norm of grain. This was hard and monotonous work, which was likely done in turns. The millstones were heavy, and turning them required considerable effort. The resulting coarse flour was the basis for all dishes. The simplest and quickest option was pulse, a thick porridge. Water was poured into the campaign kettle. Patera, salt and flour were added, and it was cooked until ready. Depending on availability, other ingredients could go into the porridge. Chopped bacon, beans, lentils, onions, or foraged herbs. If time and conditions permitted, the soldiers baked bread. This was a more laborious process. Dough was mixed from flour, water, and salt, using a leaven that they carried with them. The bread could be baked on hot stones by the fire, or in more stationary camps in special clay ovens, klebanis. This bread, panis militaris, was dense, coarse, and very filling. Besides porridge and bread, soldiers prepared various pottages and stews. Everything that could be obtained went into the kettle. Dried meat, vegetables, legumes, seasonings. Garlic and onions were especially prized, as they gave flavor to even the simplest dish. Cooking was a collective process that brought the soldiers together. Each soldier had his own personal mess kit. It usually consisted of a bowl, a cup, and a spoon. The Romans did not use forks. Food was taken by hand or eaten with a spoon. This simple kit was light, durable, and multifunctional. The bowl could be used for both porridge and drinks. The process of eating was also strictly regulated. There were usually 2 main meals. One in the morning, before the start of the march or work, a lighter one, and the main meal in the evening after returning to camp. The evening meal was not only a time to satisfy hunger, but also for social interaction. The soldiers of the contubernium gathered around the fire, ate from a common kettle, and discuss the day's events. This system had many advantages. It was flexible, as 8 men could quickly prepare food for themselves in any conditions. It was reliable, as it did not depend on one large field kitchen, which could be put out of action, and it fostered self-reliance and mutual responsibility in the soldiers. This cell of 8 men was the heart of the army. The soldiers who ground grain together, cooked together, and ate together were bound by ties that were stronger than kinship. They knew they could rely on each other, not only in battle, but also in daily life. And this confidence was no less important than a sharp sword or a sturdy shield. But how was this entire system, based on thousands of small contubernia, supplied with food on an industrial scale? In the next chapter, we will talk about the gigantic logistics machine that fed the legions. The Roman army might have been strong in the spirit of its soldiers, but it moved exclusively on its stomach. And this stomach was enormous. Supplying hundreds of thousands of legionaries scattered across a gigantic territory from Britain to Syria was a logistical task of titanic proportions. This task was solved with typical Roman pragmatism and efficiency, and at the center of this system stood the horea, the granaries. Horea were not just warehouses, they were true engineering masterpieces designed for one purpose: to keep grain dry and protected. The Romans were the first to approach this issue from a scientific point of view. A typical military granary was a long, rectangular building, but its main feature was hidden from view. The floor in a harem never lay directly on the ground. It was raised on rows of stone or brick pillars, creating an underfloor space. This ensured constant air circulation, which prevented the accumulation of moisture in the rotting of the grain. It was a simple but ingenious ventilation system that allowed grain to be stored for years. The walls were also built with ventilation and protection in mind. They were thick to maintain a stable temperature inside and often had special ventilation slits protected from rodents. Buttresses on the outer perimeter of the walls helped to withstand the enormous lateral pressure created by the tons of grain piled inside. The location of the horea was not accidental. They were built in every major fort and fortress, usually in the very center, next to the headquarters, the Principia. This emphasized their strategic importance. The granary was the heart of the camp, its most valuable treasure, which was guarded as carefully as the treasury. But how did the grain get into these storehouses? This is where the full might of Roman infrastructure came into play. Rome built its famous network of roads primarily for military purposes, and one of those purposes was the rapid delivery of supplies. Thousands of carts drawn by mules creaked along these roads, carrying grain from the fertile provinces to the frontiers. Even more important was water transport. Transporting goods by river or sea was tens of times cheaper and more efficient than by land. The great rivers such as the Rhine, the Danube, and the Nile were the main arteries of supply. Huge barges loaded with grain flowed in a continuous stream to the border fortresses. This system required not only engineers but also an army of bureaucrats. The procurement, transport, storage, and distribution of food were strictly bureaucratized processes. There were special officials, frumentari, although they later began to function as a secret police, who were initially responsible for the collection and supply of grain. Strict records were kept. Each contubernium receiving its norm of grain was probably checked off on lists. This allowed the command to know exactly how much food was left and for how long it would last. In the event of a siege, these figures were a matter of life and death. The system was designed to have a surplus. The granaries in the border forts had to contain enough provisions for the garrison to hold out in a siege and to supply an army setting out on a campaign. This was a strategic reserve that gave Rome flexibility in waging wars. The vulnerability of this system was its only drawback. The capture or destruction of Horea by the enemy was a catastrophe. Enemy commanders understood perfectly well that the best way to defeat a Roman legion was to deprive it of its bread. Therefore, the granaries were one of the main targets during attacks on Roman camps. In the Roman army, food was not just a means of sustaining life, it was a powerful tool of management and discipline. Commanders perfectly understood that control over provisions gave them direct control over the soldiers' behavior. Through a system of rewards and punishments related to food, they forged the very iron discipline for which the legions were famous. The basis of this system was that the basic ration, the frumentum, was the soldier's guaranteed right. He had earned it by enlisting, but everything above this basic norm was a privilege that had to be earned. This created a clear and understandable motivation. The most famous punishment related to food was the transfer of a delinquent unit from wheat to barley. As we have already mentioned, barley was considered animal feed or the food of the lower class. For a proud legionary who considered himself the flower of Roman citizenship, eating barley porridge instead of wheat bread was a public humiliation. This punishment was psychologically calibrated. It did not maim the soldier or deprive him of the calories needed for service, but it struck at his pride. An entire cohort forced to eat barley became an object of ridicule for the rest of the legion. This created powerful collective pressure, forcing soldiers to watch each other and avoid misconduct. In more serious cases, direct ration cuts could be applied. Soldiers who showed cowardice or disobedience could have their rations reduced. This was already a physical punishment that quickly brought the offenders to their senses. Under conditions of constant physical exertion, even a small reduction in the amount of food was felt very acutely. On the other hand, food was also the main tool of reward. For bravery shown in battle or diligence in work, a soldier could be rewarded. A commander could order an extra portion of wine, a piece of meat, or white bread, which was valued much more than the soldier's bread, to be given to distinguished fighters. Special feasts, epulae, were held in honor of great victories or important holidays. On these days, the army received abundant food, often at the expense of trophies or the generosity of the general. These were not just dinners, but ritual actions that strengthened the bond between the commander and his soldiers. A general who was not stingy with treats for his warriors enjoyed their limitless devotion. The very process of distributing food was a demonstration of hierarchy. Officers and centurions received better quality products and in greater variety. Their diet was closer to that of a city dweller than to the ration of a simple legionary. This was a visible embodiment of their status and power. Even during sieges, food remained a tool of control. Historians describe cases where commanders, in order to stop panic and despair in a besieged city, publicly displayed the remaining food supplies. This was intended to convince both the enemy and their own people that they had enough food to hold out for a long time. Roman generals understood that a hungry soldier is a bad soldier. He is not thinking about the glory of Rome, but about his stomach. Therefore, ensuring provisions was their primary concern. But they also understood that a well-fed and satisfied soldier is a manageable soldier. Thus, the soldier's kettle was just as important a battlefield for discipline as the training ground. Through the simple system of issuing grain, meat, or wine, Roman commanders managed the moods and behaviors of thousands of men, turning them into a single obedient mechanism. The Roman Empire stretched for thousands of kilometers, encompassing the most diverse climatic and cultural zones. From the foggy forests of Britain to the scorched deserts of Syria. Although the legionaries' basic ration, based on grain, remained unchanged, it inevitably adapted and was enriched by local products. The Roman army was not only a conqueror, but also a great culinary adapter. When the legions arrived in a new province, they brought their habits with them. They brought wheat, grapes, and olives. In many regions, such as Britain, these crops were previously unknown. The soldiers, and later the veterans who founded colonies, began to grow the products they were used to, forever changing the agriculture of the conquered lands. However, the army could not be completely dependent on imported products. Logistics were expensive and difficult. Therefore, the legions actively used local resources. In Britain, where wheat grew poorly, soldiers probably had to consume barley or oats more often, which was a traditional local crop. Instead of wine, which was difficult to deliver to the northern provinces, soldiers adopted the local habit of drinking beer or cerveza. Archaeologists find numerous evidences of brewing in Roman forts in Britain and Germany. Beer was a caloric and nutritious drink that fit perfectly into the soldier's ration, although for a native Roman, it was considered a barbarian drink. At the same time in Egypt or Syria, the situation was the reverse. Here, products unfamiliar to an Italian were available in abundance. The diet of the legionaries stationed on the eastern borders was enriched with dates, lentils, chickpeas, and a variety of local fruits. Olive oil, which in Britain was an imported luxury, was the main and cheapest fat here. The army was the main channel through which these new products spread throughout the empire. Soldiers who had served their time in Syria returned to Italy or Gaul and brought new culinary habits with them. This is how, for example, cherries, which the general Lucullus brought from one of his eastern campaigns, spread throughout the empire. This adaptation was a matter of survival. A legion that knew how to use local resources was less dependent on the whims of central supply. Soldiers learned from the local population which plants were edible, where to find water, and how to prepare unfamiliar food. It was a two-way exchange. Rome brought its culture, but it also absorbed the culture of the conquered peoples. Archaeological finds confirm this. The analysis of rubbish pits in Roman forts is a real treasure trove of information. In Germany, they find the bones of pigs and cows, as well as a large number of fish hooks. In Egypt, date pits and olive stones. In Britain, nutshells and the bones of local game. This flexibility was one of the strengths of the Roman army. They did not try to blindly impose their diet where it was impossible or inefficient. They took their proven grain base and strung local products onto it, creating a unique but functional diet each time. This also influenced the economy of the provinces. The presence of a huge army, which was a solvent and constant consumer, stimulated local production. Peasants began to grow what the legions needed, be it wheat, barley, or livestock. The army became the locomotive of the local economy. Thus, there was no single legionary menu for the entire empire. There was a single principle, a high-calorie grain base, supplemented with proteins and fats. But what exactly it was supplemented with depended on where the soldier was serving, on the snowy Rhine or the hot Euphrates. Until now, we have been talking about the diet of the common legionary, the Miles Gregarious. His food was simple, functional, and monotonous. But the Roman army was a strictly hierarchical structure, and this hierarchy was fully reflected at the dinner table. The officers, centurions, tribunes, and legates, ate completely differently. Their diet was not just food, it was a symbol of their status. The main difference was in quality and variety. If the common soldier received coarsely ground flour, the officers ate white, well-sifted bread, panis candidus. It was considered more prestigious and was a sign of high position. They did not grind the grain by hand. This work was done for them by their servants or slaves. The same applied to drinks. The common soldier drank pasca or cheap local wine. The officers, however, drank quality wine, often imported from Italy or other famous winemaking regions. Archaeologists find amphorae with stamps in officers' quarters that testify to the supply of expensive wines from thousands of kilometers away. The officers' diet was much richer in meat. They did not depend on occasional handouts or holidays. At their disposal were their own cooks, who prepared complex dishes for them. In the rubbish pits near officers' dwellings, they find the bones not only of pigs and cows but also of poultry, such as chickens, geese, and ducks. Imported delicacies played a huge role. Officers, even while on a wild frontier, tried to maintain the Roman lifestyle they were accustomed to. They ordered and received products that were completely inaccessible to common soldiers. High-quality olive oil, garum, fish sauce from Spain, exotic spices like pepper from India. Pepper was a particular luxury item. It was incredibly expensive but very popular among the elite. The discovery of peppercorns in Roman forts, such as Vindolanda, in the dwellings of the command staff, indicates that officers spent considerable money to make their food tasty and prestigious. The dining setting also differed radically. If soldiers ate from simple clay bowls sitting by the fire, officers dined in their comfortable quarters, the praetorium or the centurions' houses. They used expensive tableware, silver platters, goblets, and imported pottery, such as terra sigillata. For officers, eating was not just satisfying hunger, but an important social ritual. The commander of the legion, the legate, would host feasts for his tribunes and centurions. These were not just dinners, but a form of business communication, where plans were discussed, problems were solved, and bonds were strengthened. The atmosphere was much closer to a dinner party in Rome than to a soldier's meal. This difference in diet was a visible and constant reminder of the gap that lay between the common soldier and the command staff. It emphasized hierarchy and discipline. The soldier saw that his commander lived better, and this was part of the natural order of things. However, one should not think that the officers were effete gourmets. They were required to share all the hardships of a campaign with the soldiers, if not the diet. A good commander, like Emperor Hadrian himself, could eat simple soldiers' food, bacon, cheese, and drink Pascha, to show his unity with the troops. But this was precisely a gesture, not the daily reality. In stationary camps, the difference in diets was at its maximum. On the march, far from supply bases, this difference inevitably blurred. Both officers and soldiers were forced to eat whatever they could get. But as soon as the legion returned to its fort, the hierarchy was immediately restored, including in the kitchen. We have taken a long journey into the field kitchen of the Roman legion. We saw that behind the myth of the invincible army stood not only iron discipline, but an equally iron system of supply. This system was based on a simple but incredibly effective product: grain. It was the universal fuel that powered Rome's conquests. We learned that the legionaries' diet, although monotonous, was carefully thought out. Grain for energy, legumes and meat for protein, Pascha for hydration and hygiene, vegetables and fruits for vitamins. Each element of this ration served its clear function. Food was not a pleasure but an instrument of war, just like a sword or a shield. We also saw how this system adapted to local conditions and how it reflected the strict hierarchy of Roman society. From the common kettle of the contubernium to the refined table of the legate, food was a language in which the army spoke of status, discipline, and power. This seemingly boring topic reveals to us the deepest mechanisms of how the greatest military machine in history functioned. What other aspects of life in ancient Rome or other great civilizations would you like us to explore? Suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you would like to see on our channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes.